Yes, you can actually make your own custom levels for this game. Well, it's not that difficult. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get the background working properly. Now, if you guys want to download this level yourself, just follow the link and instructions in the additional information section below the video.
What's this? First blood. Die. Revenge.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Worms, which at the time it was made was an extremely fresh take on the artillery game genre. Virtually every artillery game up to this point was sort of semi-serious, using tanks or other machines of war to lob explosives at each other. Plus, most such games only took place on a single screen with no kind of panning or zooming going on. Worms deviated from this format dramatically by replacing tanks with tiny little worms spouting jokes and sarcasm, and by having some of the weapons be a bit more ridiculous than one might imagine. It also gave players a multi-screen playfield to work with, and the ability to move anywhere they'd want to on their turn until they fired a weapon. Now, this is going to be a tricky game to comment on, because so many of the things you can do in this game really depend on the situation you're in. Not to mention luck, since some of the weapons can't normally be obtained unless they're a part of a challenge level or you get one from a weapons drop. For instance, out of all the gameplay footage I got, there wasn't a single moment where I could have really put the ninja rope, bungee cords, or even the girders to use. And every time they would have been useful, I was in a challenge level that didn't give me any. So while I will be talking about every weapon and item you can use, I don't actually have gameplay footage of all of them. I also happen to be playing the Worms United pack, which includes both the original game along with its expansion, Worms Reinforcements, which is why I was able to make my own custom level in the first place. Worms was developed by Team 17 and published by Ocean in 1995. It's technically a 1 to 16 player artillery game, since up to 16 worms can be present as a single match, but each team has 4 worms on it. So typically when playing solo or with just 1 or 2 other people, each actual player will play all 4 worms on one team. It only supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, but its audio support includes Sound Blaster cards, the Gravis Ultrasound, the Ensoniq Soundscape, and the Microsoft Sound System. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but easily obtained from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com, where you can get the Worms United pack as a digital download for $6. If you want a physical copy, then be prepared to shell out a bit of money, as they're collector's items now and tend to run above the $30 mark for the Amiga version. As for the DOS version, I wasn't even able to find any online, so I don't have a clue how valuable they are. But since the Amiga version is so much more prevalent and easy to find, I can't imagine a physical copy of the DOS version would be cheap if you came across one. Being an artillery game, the gameplay has the same basic formula as games such as Tank Wars and Scorched Earth. When it's a worm's turn, they have to select a weapon, aim, and shoot at a various level of power to determine how far the shot will go. However, the game quickly diverges from this formula and how it all works. For starters, worms are not stationary, so they can move anywhere they want to on their turn, provided they don't run out of time. They have the ability to jump too, but you need to be careful not to fall from too great a height, otherwise you'll take some damage and your turn will end before you can even take a shot. Firing weapons is also a little different. In typical artillery games, you would select your shot power directly, but in Worms, you hold the fire button down to build up power and release to actually fire. The longer you hold the button down for it, the further the shot will fly. This can take a little practice and makes it very difficult to get your shots into the exact same place multiple times in a row, not helped by the wind levels which change direction every turn. Against other real people, this helps to balance the game out, but against CPU opponents with high skill settings, it actually gives them a bit of an unfair advantage, which you'll need some skill and luck to overcome. Another divergence is that you can't actually kill any worms in a single shot unless you get extremely lucky with some of the rare weapons, or your shot knocks the worm into other dangerous things like landmines or a screen edge. Typically though, it takes at least 2 attacks to kill a worm, so you need to be creative about not only how you attack, but how you keep your attacking worm as safe as possible until it's their turn again. In terms of getting rare weapons, there's a couple ways this works. Whenever you start a game, it's a good idea to see what weapons you have available. And some weapons will have numbers on them to indicate you can only use them a limited number of times. Some weapons may also have hyphens instead of numbers, indicating that you will have some of those weapons available very soon, but you have to wait for reinforcements to arrive. The best way to get more weapons, though, are weapon crates dropped from the sky. There's a couple varieties of these, including one that simply restores health, and another that will give you some additional weaponry, or possibly make your existing weapons more powerful. And just be cautious about these things, because if weapon crates take even a slight amount of damage, they can explode. In fact, they have an extremely small chance of exploding anyway when you grab them. Each match ends when only one team is left, or if all teams are eliminated, the match is drawn. In the challenge mode, which is designed for single-player gameplay, a drawn match will allow you to play the level again without having to put the password back in. Typically, there's also a time limit for the entire match, not just each worm's turn, and if this time limit expires, the game goes into sudden death mode, where all surviving worms are dropped down to a single unit of health. Before I talk about the weapons though, there's a couple things I should mention about the options. The first is that there are a ton of gameplay options you can choose from, which is actually par for the course for an artillery game, since many of the good ones had tons of options. The second thing though is that the game doesn't automatically save any of the things that go on the disc, which is kinda strange for a mid-90s DOS game. Instead, you have to make sure you click the save status buttons that appear every so often, or go into the options menu and save everything from there. It's a bit of a nuisance and likely a holdover from the game's roots on Amiga systems.
Whoa!
This game has a massive variety of weapons, and while I don't have footage of everything, I can at least describe what they all do. The first weapon on hand is the Bazooka, a very basic weapon with a good blast radius that explodes on impact. It's what you would call the default weapon of this game, and ironically, despite all the effort that went into the wind system, it's the only weapon that's really affected by it. The next weapon is the homing missile, which functions similarly to the Bazooka, except that you have to select a target before you can fire, and a moment after firing, the missile's engines kick in and direct it as best as it can towards the target you selected. Now, it's not 100% perfect, so sometimes, depending on the angle you're firing from, it may help to select a targeting position slightly ahead of or behind the spot you actually want to hit. Next up are grenades, which have the same kind of explosive properties as the Bazooka, but function very differently. Before throwing a grenade, you have the ability to adjust its timer between 1 and 5 seconds, as well as set how much bounce the grenade will have on impact, since, unlike the Bazooka, grenades do not explode on impact. On the flip side, they're not affected by wind either, so they're the weapon of choice if the wind is against you or you're trying to get your shot into a little crater or hole of some sort. Cluster bombs are basically the same sort of deal, except instead of one large explosion after the timer is set, they explode into several little bomblets, each of which have a small explosion on impact, thus spreading damage over a wider area. There's also a rare weapon called banana bombs that are just like cluster bombs but are ridiculously powerful by comparison. In fact, they're probably the most powerful weapon in the entire game. Next up is the shotgun, which functions just as you would expect. You aim it and shoot. But because the shotgun is double-barreled and you fire each shot independently, you get 2 shots per turn with it, and can still move around after firing the first shot. A very handy tactic with the shotgun is to use your first shot to hit a worm, then go somewhere safe and just waste the second shot. The Uzi lets you let loose a barrage of bullets, which can not only be handy for taking out multiple worms in your line of sight, but can also help tunnel through walls. The minigun is another rare weapon that you typically only get from crates, but is basically a souped-up version of the Uzi that needs to be used at closer range to do maximum damage. Next we have the Fire Punch, which is similar to Ryu's Shoryuken move from the Street Fighter games, where the worm will jump high into the air, knocking any other worm it hits upwards as well. While the move doesn't do a lot of damage, it's a good way to safely knock an opponent worm out of the way if they're too close. A similar move you can perform is the Dragon Ball, which doesn't grant you wishes, but instead acts like Ryu's Hadoken move, shooting out a ball of energy that will send opposing worms soaring backwards at high speed, and is again useful for getting a worm out of the way. Next we have Airstrikes, which are very useful when one of your worms is stuck in a spot where they can't really do anything. When you call in an airstrike, you simply select where to drop the bombs, and after a moment, several bombs will blanket the area you pointed out, spreading damage all across it. While the airstrikes aren't very good for taking out single targets, they can really help for softening up enemy forces that are clustered together. Next up is Dynamite, a very powerful weapon with a huge blast radius, but because of how big it is, you can't actually throw it. Instead, when your worm places it, you're given 5 seconds to get out of the way before it explodes. And trust me, you want to be as far away as possible when it does. Next are landmines, which typically dot the landscape at the start of every level, but you have the ability to place them yourself as well, and just like with Dynamite, you get a few seconds to get away once placed. Next are the sheep. Now, this sadistic weapon only comes from crates, and when released will run around without a care in the world until you hit the fire button again, at which point it will detonate the sheep with much the same ferocity as the dynamite. I mean, really, exploding sheep? The next thing you're going to tell me is that your worms can don Japanese bandanas and do kamikaze strikes. I know you guys can't actually see me, but I am face-palming really hard right now. Anyways, that's basically it for the main weapons. There's also something called mole bombs, but they're not listed in the manual, nor have I ever encountered them in the game, so I have to wonder if they even exist. Everything else is more of a utility item than an actual weapon, but they do still serve some purposes, so let's go over them. The teleports are incredibly useful for turning the tide of battle. They basically let you teleport a worm to any place you want on the map, and they can be used to get a worm out of a dangerous situation, or even get them into one if it's a strategically good thing to do. For instance, since worms will detonate themselves when they run out of health, if you have a worm with 5 points of health left or less, you can teleport them into a high altitude spot above an enemy worm, so that when they fall and die, the blast damages the enemy worm. The next two items, the blowtorch and pneumatic drill, can do small amounts of damage to enemy worms, but are mostly used to tunnel around the landscape. The blowtorch lets you tunnel through sideways, while the pneumatic drill is used to tunnel straight down. There's also bungee cords and ninja ropes you can use to get around the landscape, but these items can be tricky to put to good use. However, you don't end your turn when you use them, so on the very rare occasions when it's possible to put them to use, you should give them a try. Ninja ropes are fired and attached into walls to pull you across to them, while bungee cords automatically activate when you approach the edge of a cliff, allowing you to safely fall down it. The last item you have access to are girders, which can be placed around your worm to help protect them from incoming attacks, or to help bridge a gap provided the enemy doesn't blow the girder to pieces following. You also have the ability to prod enemy worms, doing no damage to them and only pushing them by a few pixels. But in a multiplayer game, this can be a hilarious and humiliating way to end a worm's life, if you end up pushing them off a cliff or into a landmine or something. Overall, Worms is a very fun game, and at the time it was released gave a fresh, new perspective on how the artillery genre could work. As with every game in the Worms series, they're much more fun to play multiplayer with friends than solo against the computer, since the computer AI doesn't really have much of a range to it, being either incredibly stupid, barely able to play, or too smart for its own good. This is actually a problem with a lot of artillery games, and as such, there's very few that play well solo for these reasons. Still, if you have any interest in the genre at all, then it's a good idea to try the original Worms at least once just to see what you think of it. Setting the game up in DOSBox is a piece of cake. Just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. And curiously, the GOG release also sets the CPU type value to 486 slow, but this doesn't really seem to affect the gameplay in the slightest. At least not with the most recent version of DOSBox, so maybe this is just something that had to be done earlier on and doesn't need to be worried about anymore. But yeah, default DOSBox settings should play the game perfectly fine. Also keep in mind if you have a CD-based release that has CD audio to it, you'll need to convert the CD into a QBin image file pair and image mount it in DOSBox to get the CD audio working properly. And that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and because I've been continually lacking the spare time necessary to get my music update going, it's about time I gave myself an ultimatum. Next week's filler will primarily be to announce the completed upload of all of my music to my website so that you guys can download it all and check it out. Though that's not the only thing I'm going to be covering, as there's a number of little things I've been wanting to mention for the past while that I really should take a moment to address. So make sure you stay tuned for next Saturday to see what's up.